In this episode, we talk about a new challenge that has emerged for residents of the border villages in Jammu and Kashmir. We also talk about India's disclosure of details regarding Operation Sindoor. But first, we talk about the IMF's decision to release $1 billion to Pakistan. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last week, at the height of the military confrontation between India and Pakistan, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, released $1 billion to Pakistan as part of its extended fund facility. The decision sparked criticism within India, with some accusing the IMF of indirectly funding terrorism. India's Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri even urged the IMF board to reflect deeply before generously bailing out Pakistan. However, it turns out that a $7 billion loan had already been approved back in September, and releasing this tranche was simply a formality. But this does raise two key questions. How does the IMF approve its loans? And is it concerned about giving funds to a country with a history of harboring terror camps? To answer these questions, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Udit Misra.
Udit, before we talk about how IMF approves these loans, what goes behind it, and why has IMF been giving loans to Pakistan over the years, why don't we start with the basics? Tell us, what is the main function of this organization?
Yeah, so the IMF is the International Monetary Fund, and it was created alongside the World Bank. Many of the listeners would have heard both IMF and World Bank often talked in policy circles. Both were created at the same time in 1944 as a result of what was called the Bretton Woods Conference at the end of the Second World War. And the idea behind that was there was a lot of decimation, as many of you might know, that Second World War left a lot of countries that needed reconstruction, needed help. But there was also this realization that the 1930s, the period between the First World War and the Second World War, saw a lot of economic upheavals, a lot of economic distress, and in particular, countries like Germany, which were asked to give a lot of money as reparation payments, very onerous conditions, they just couldn't deal with those requirements. And in the absence of robust economic growth and proper economic management, they went through a cycle where economic distress created social distress and a reaction, which led to conditions that led to the Second World War. So the idea is to sort of ensure that all countries of the world, regardless of what size they are and which ideological alignment they are in, they get the assistance, the benefits of mainstream economics understanding and both expertise and some kind of a help in terms of finances. Mostly these are in IMF's case, these are in the form of loans given, short-term loans given with the preconditions that, the government should do this or the economy should do this or these parameters should be met for the next tranche to come. So that's the idea behind IMF.
Right, and some of these things, for example, like advising different countries and tracking economies, those are really back-end things in that sense. But what makes news are, of course, these loans that it gives out, right? So could you talk about what are the things that IMF looks at when giving these loans and what are the countries that end up receiving them?
So, mostly by definition are economies which are struggling on macroeconomic parameters. Pakistan is a good example. And many of our listeners would recall that in the early 1991-92, we were in a very similar position where we had a balance of payment crisis. India ran a centralized planned economy and we reached a point where we had to mortgage our gold and we needed a course correction. And we took loans from IMF with a policy prescription. We changed those things, opening up of the economy where, the role of the government, the role of the private sector, everything had to be reset. And we did that.
Yeah, and these were two major things that really turned India's economy, liberalization and getting rid of the license Raj. And you're saying that both these things were actually demands of the IMF.
Exactly. So the idea is that the government is inefficient if it starts doing everything in the economy, whereas India's old model was that government would do most of the things in the economy. that was the centralized planning model, and it had inefficiencies. And requirements from the IMF for those loans were that you'll open up your economy, you will trade more, you will not fix prices. Government would not fix prices of everything from soap to oil to flight tickets. Let the private sector come in the market, let it compete and find the best solutions, and open your markets to competition. So all of those things, and don't let government sort of do everything, or excessive borrowings by the government, which will basically take away all the money that could have gone as loans to private players. So we did turn a corner because of the same policies that IMF had. And since then, India has just shot up in terms of economic size. And today there's no doubt about India's economic might. The problem with, say, a country like Pakistan has been that they've taken that help repeatedly and failed to turn around. They've taken one loan after another in the last few years. All that you can hear is Pakistan trying to avoid bankruptcy by taking yet another loan.
And could you also give a sense of just how bad Pakistan's economy is? Like, how would you compare it to some of the other struggling economies?
So there are different ways in which one could look at an economy. You could look at, macro parameters like GDP per capita, inflation rate, foreign exchange reserves. On all those parameters, Pakistan has been really in a very sad state. For example, GDP, the overall economic output of the country. Pakistan's GDP has been stagnant for the last 10 years roughly. I was looking at the data, and their GDP in 2023 was lower than their GDP in 2017. So, 6 years have passed and your GDP is lower than that. And when I say stagnant, which means 1 year it'll go up, the next year it'll go down, and roughly it'll stay in that range. So that has been the story for the last 10 years. And on social parameters, health, education, physical infrastructure, they've just not gone anywhere. And as a result, even though the population has increased, it has not become more productive, right? And terrorism itself, while it is very natural for us to feel like the victims of terrorism, without realizing the biggest victims of that terror are the Pakistanis themselves, because they are the ones who have actually lost half a century, trying to basically detract others while they lose their own way. So it's a sad commentary on their economic management that none of the parameters that you pick up will show any improvement, and they just do not have enough money to pay their bills. They do not produce enough at home, and whatever they import, they cannot pay that bill. So they have to actually borrow money to then import. And that makes them a real, both threat and a nuisance, because they are also a nuclear power.
Right. So for a country in such a state, it would make sense why IMF would want to help it. But as you mentioned, IMF also has certain conditions, right? So what do we know about the extent to which Pakistan has been listening to the IMF and has been fulfilling its demands? And also, how much has Pakistan borrowed from the IMF over the years?
Okay, so I think on 28 of the last 35 years, IMF has given them money. Each of these tranches would run into billions of dollars. So $1 billion is 8,500 crores. So you can understand that while this is in itself, one tranche may not be the amount of money that will make or break Pakistan's fortunes, but when you add up, it's a substantive amount. And also the fact that Pakistan has not been borrowing just from IMF. Pakistan has been borrowing from every conceivable source. From China, there's a Paris Club group of countries. I think there's a Nordic Development Group. Just if you look at the numbers, it's quite remarkable. The thousands of crores has been borrowed at different points in time. Now, in this particular case, under the extended fund facility, which is the specific facility under which Pakistan is being given money, this was signed on last year, September 2024. And the idea was that a total of $7 billion will be given to Pakistan in separate tranches. It was given $1 billion last year, and I think now a review has taken of what the Pakistan government and economic management has been, and another $1 billion has been given after that review, right? And so another $5 billion is left if they keep sticking to their targets. And apart from the extended fund facility, they've also been given $1.4 billion for some climate change objectives under the Resilience Fund. So that also is an issue with Pakistan. Every country is facing climate change problems. Pakistan in particular is a country which is genuinely suffering from that. So another 1.4 billion was given on that. Now, when IMF has given this money, it's a case of bad timing, that because from Indian perspective, it looks as if IMF is just funding terror.
Yeah, because the approvals happened last year. It's just that they had to go through with this formality of giving it right now. But because of the Pahalgam terror attack and what followed, the optics for many was that, you're giving billions of dollars to a country responsible for this.
Yeah, and to be fair to Pakistan, the review that IMF did find that things have improved. But the problem with Pakistan is that things are so bad that when we talk about improvement, it's a relative term. For example, we've had so many discussions about, India's inflation rate being higher than 6%, and RBI not doing enough, this and that, and what is the government doing? In Pakistan, inflation rate in the last 2 years has been upwards of 24-25%. If you take the last 5 years, say from 2020 to 2024, prices went up by 215%. So whatever was 100 rupees at the end of 2019 became 215 rupees at the end of 2024. And this is a period over which I told you that GDP did not increase much, right? So the overall incomes have not gone up, but the prices have gone up, more than doubled. So you can imagine the kind of state that Pakistanis or an average Pakistani would be, right? And this is where I'm saying that it's a dangerous proposition, because economic distress does create a lot of social reaction. You choose incorrectly. And we've seen that even in richer countries like Britain or US, where populations can choose in a very reactionary manner and take decisions like a Brexit, which may not necessarily be in their long-term interest.
And Udit, you earlier mentioned, that this approval happened because IMF saw some improvements. So one, what were those improvements? And the second thing is that doesn't IMF consider Pakistan's history when it comes to harboring terror camps in its country? Doesn't it factor that at all?
So two things. One is on what they judged Pakistan on. So they say that, for example, government borrowings are trending down, whatever Pakistan is borrowing. So one big problem, one of the structural problems with Pakistan is that government borrows too much and then borrows for the wrong reasons. And this is a discussion we've had so many times. What is a good level for government to borrow and where to invest that money? In Pakistan, that level has now been trending down. And I say trending down only from the perspective that it might not necessarily be at the ideal level right now, but, it's trending down. The other things like inflation rate for April came out to be 0.3. So the prices just went up by 0.3% in April. Now, they can still go up again next month and in a few months later, and quite likely that they may still go up. But, even if it is, if you're coming from a level of 24 and 30% inflation, then, you don't need to improve much or bring it down to much to show improvement. So those kind of numbers. So it's not as if IMF is just totally, willingly giving this money for terrorism. And the other thing is that there are facilities, as I said, there is money given for climate objectives, there are money given for monetary improvements or banking improvements or whatever, and they are judged on those basis. Now, these are obviously not mutually exclusive. Pakistan could still be funding terror in some other way, and frankly, from what we have understood living with this problem for such a long time is that terrorism is not just limited by terror funding. Terrorism, frankly, has become a state of mind for a people. So we have to be very careful that thinking that just shutting all taps on improving what can improve the country will necessarily solve the terrorism problem. That may not necessarily be true. Having better monitoring of Pakistan's money flow might be a very justified case that, international bodies have to pay more attention to how this money is spent and put more onerous demands on Pakistan's. But I am not necessarily sure if you were to rob Pakistan of any external guidance, money, expertise, and leave them on their own, that they would actually be able to all of a sudden say, okay, even though we don't have money, we will now not do anything and just go back to doing the right things. We might actually be just further leaving the economy and the society at the mercy of whatever that radical thinking is.
And next, back home in Jammu and Kashmir, a new challenge has emerged for residents of the border villages. After both India and Pakistan agreed to halt their fierce military confrontation, the heavy shelling in Jammu and Kashmir's border villages came to a stop. However, a quieter threat still looms for thousands of residents in Uri, Baramulla and Kupwara districts, that of unexploded munitions scattered across fields, courtyards and homes.
People want to return. Some of them have started returning. But main problem with the police, with the security forces and the civil administration now is that thousands of shells from across the border were fired on civilian areas.
This is the Indian Express's Arun Sharma, who reported on the story for the newspaper.
A number of them are unexploded. Police and the security forces, they have to clear those unexploded shells so that the people returning home may not touch them and then get hurt or they suffer any other damage. So they are appealing people not to touch any suspicious looking object. If they come across any, inform the police or the nearest security forces personnel. A number of unexploded shells have been diffused by the bomb disposal squads along the LOC, also along the international border as well.
And Arun, this situation with these unexploded shells or munitions sounds pretty concerning. But in reality, what kind of threat do they pose to the villagers?
If they play with them, if they do something with them, they might explode. They might take their lives and even cause damage to the property also.
And you also speak of, posters have gone up warning people not to return home yet. So can you tell us how are the authorities handling this? Like, who is clearing these unexploded shells and how long is it expected to take?
It will not take much time. The bomb disposal squads are on the job. Basically, in the initial days of when ceasefire took place on the evening of 10th, there were certain advisories from the police at certain places asking people not to return immediately at some places, not at all the places. What the officials say, there is a protocol even after the returning to an area which had been a war zone in the past. There is a protocol. Basically, reason is that there may be many things which may be lying scattered here and there, explosive things. Many of those may have been fired by the enemy from across the border. All those things have to be removed. The area has to be cleared so that people, once they return home, they are able to lead a normal life. Otherwise, what will happen? If someone returns home and unfortunately comes across an explosive device and it explodes, again, it will be a problem in the area. It will lead to civilian casualties.
And Arun, you have been reporting from the ground about all this while and, have been speaking to many of the 50,000 people who have been displaced. So can you tell us what did they have to say about the situation and how are they handling it?
A number of them, they are putting up in camps set up by the government administration at safe places. A number of others, they have moved either to alternate places built by them or to the houses of their relations in safer places. But everywhere, people say that they stand with the government. They support all the measures taken by the government post-Pahalgam terror attack. But they say that they can't trust Pakistan because according to them, it is their second or third generation which is witnessing a war with Pakistan. And every time they say that mischief comes from across the border. Most of them wanted a decision. It should be a last war with Pakistan. A final decision shall be taken so that the future generations, they live in peace.
And Arun, we understand that this isn't the first time villagers have experienced cross-border fire. So is it any different this time?
Yes, it is certainly different. Earlier, what used to happen, it used to be a small arms fire or mortar shells, basically. The last time artillery fire came along the border was in 1971 war. And thereafter, during all these years in the past, it was small arms fire or maximum mortar shelling. But this time, artillery shelling also started, and artillery shelling started hitting the residential civilian areas also. For example, Punch Town. Artillery fire was never fired towards Punch Town. RT shells never fell in Punchtown, even in 1971 war. But this time, hundreds of shells, they fell in Punchtown, causing damage. Only in Punchtown, 12 civilians got killed. Nearly 3 dozen others got injured. Sizable number of houses, shops, and other property got damaged. Number 2, apart from RT fire, this time drones and missiles were also fired. The drones and missiles reached as far off areas like on the outskirts of Jammu city, like Nagrota. Even far off towns, like towns far away from the LCR, the international border, like Udhampur. So all these things, this change in strategy of warfare, this has made the officials rethink constructing bunkers even in cities like Jammu or Udhampur, a thing which was never thought of in the past because these places were considered safer in case of war.
And also, apart from clearing these unexploded munitions, you also highlight that the security forces are conducting infiltration checks. So, how concerned are authorities about this?
These infiltration attempts have not happened for the first time during these days. Actually, in the past also, Pakistani troops used to target Indian side with unprovoked firing as a cover fire to terrorists attempting to infiltrate. This time also, what happened that when there was heavy shelling going on along the international border or the LC, there were attempts by groups of terrorists to infiltrate over to the Indian side. But because the troops were already there, they were in good numbers, they were retaliating to the Pakistani fire. When they saw the infiltrators, they challenged them also, and some of them got killed, some of them ran back to their own side.
And finally, Arun, can you tell us what's next for the people there? Like, when might people be able to return? And what are officials saying about, how long this recovery might take?
Actually, everybody is waiting just for looking at that situation normalizes. It is a matter of maybe by weekend, if everything remains the same, peace continues holding, then maybe by end of this week, they may return. This is what many in the administration feel. Even those staying in camps, they are not putting up in camps 24/7. During the day, some of them go to their homes. They only return to the camps in the night, fearing there may not be escalation during night, and then it will be difficult for them to run for safety.
And in the end, we take a closer look at what India has now disclosed about the details of Operation Sindoor and the confrontation that followed it. Over the past 48 hours, senior military leadership briefed President Draupadi Murmu on the conduct and outcomes of Operation Sindoor. According to the official statement from Rashtrapati Bhavan, the president commended the valor and dedication of the armed forces that made India's response to terrorism a sterling success. Now, for the first time, official sources have disclosed the extent of damage inflicted during the strikes. India's precision strikes on over a dozen military bases across Pakistan, they say, destroyed nearly 20% of Pakistan Air Force's infrastructure, several PAF fighter aircraft, and resulted in the deaths of more than 50 personnel, including a squadron leader and 4 airmen. The strikes targeted key Pakistani air bases and ammunition depots, including Sargodha, Bhulari, Noor Khan, Sukhur, and Jacobabad. Among these, Bhulari Air Base in Sindh saw the heaviest casualties. Visual evidence released by the Indian Armed Forces shows before and after satellite images confirming destruction across multiple sites. In addition to this, India's Defence Intelligence Agency briefed military attaches from 70 countries on the planning, target selection, and joint force execution of the operation. Lieutenant General D.S. Rana, Director General of DIA, also addressed the ongoing disinformation campaign by Pakistan, describing India's response as a part of a whole-of-nation counter-narrative effort. This is part of a broader diplomatic offensive, with India reinforcing its case globally that its actions were directed at terror infrastructure, not civilians, and were proportionate responses to the Pahalgam massacre that killed 26 civilians. Meanwhile, in a rare moment of de-escalation amid heightened tensions, a BSF jawan, Poonam Kumar Shaw, who had accidentally crossed into Pakistan near Firozpur just a day after the Pahalgam attack, was handed back to India after spending 21 days in Pakistani custody. Shaw returned via the Atari border checkpoint in Amritsar following sustained flag meetings and communications made by the Border Security Force. His detention had drawn attention in West Bengal, prompting public appeals from the state government for his release. His family, speaking to the Indian Express, confirmed that they had received official confirmation and expressed relief. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.